On a quiet evening in February 2010, in a modest home in Fallbrook, California, a family of four went about what seemed like a normal night. 39-year-old Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their two young boys, Johnny, just 4 years old, and Joseph Jr., only 3, had no idea they were about to become the center of one of the most haunting mysteries in American true crime. Within just a few days, the McStay family would vanish without a trace, leaving behind an empty house, untouched dinners, and a trail of questions that would puzzle investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives for years. This is a strange case of a McStay disappearance. To truly understand the impact of their disappearance, we need to know who the McStays were. Joseph McStay was an ambitious entrepreneur. He ran a company called Earth-inspired Products, which specialized in decorative water fountains and indoor waterfalls. His work ethic and friendly demeanor had helped the business thrive, and he was always on the lookout for new opportunities. Summer, his wife, was described by friends as protective, nurturing, and sometimes a little strong-willed. She was devoted to her 2 children, keeping them close, homeschooling them, and making sure they were always cared for. Family was everything to her. The couple had been together for years, and though like any marriage they had ups and downs, their household looked from the outside like a picture of stability and love. They had recently moved into a new home in Fallbrook, excited to build their future. But as investigators would later learn, appearances can be deceiving. February 4th, 2010. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual that morning. Joseph had been in regular contact with business partners, discussing projects and meetings. At 2 p.m., he called one of his closest associates, Charles Chase Merritt, about a project they were working on. It seemed like just another business day. Later that afternoon, Joseph spoke with another colleague about meeting the following day. Everything appeared normal. No panic in his voice, no suggestion that anything was wrong. By that evening, though, communication stopped. No more calls, no more texts. The McStay family went dark. 4 days later, on February 8th, Joseph's brother, Michael, began to worry. He hadn't heard from Joseph, and attempts to reach him went unanswered. Concerned, he drove to the family's Fallbrook home. What he found inside was chilling. The house looked like the family had simply walked out in the middle of daily life. Bowls of popcorn sat on the couch. Fresh food was left out. The family dogs were in the backyard, hungry but alive. And there was no sign of Joseph, Summer, or the 2 little boys. There was no evidence of struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry, just silence. For many, this would be the moment when dread set in. 2 days later, police discovered the family's white Isuzu Trooper parked near the Mexican border in San Isidro, California. Security cameras in the area revealed a family of 4 crossing the border on foot, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, around 7 p.m. on February 8th. Could this have been the McStays? The grainy footage made it difficult to tell. The family appeared to match their description, but it was far from conclusive. Still, investigators initially leaned toward a theory that the McStays had left voluntarily, crossing into Mexico. After all, the car was left near the border, and for years, many wondered, had they chosen to start a new life, leaving everything behind? But friends and relatives didn't buy it. The idea that the McStays had run away didn't make sense to those who knew them best. Joseph loved his business. He was deeply invested in building it, and abandoning it overnight seemed unthinkable. Summer was devoted to her children. Those who knew her said she was overprotective, the kind of mother who would never expose her boys to the dangers of a foreign country without proper planning. Crossing into Mexico unprepared, no passports, no car seats, no money left behind, was completely out of character. And then there was the matter of the dogs. Anyone who knew the McStays knew they adored their pets. Leaving them behind without food or care was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Something wasn't adding up. Police began piecing together the family's last known movements. February 4th, 2010, 7:47 p.m. The last outgoing call from Joseph's cell phone was placed to his business partner, Chase Merritt. The call lasted only about a minute. After that, no further calls, texts, or emails came from either Joseph or Summer. Their computers showed no recent searches or activity suggesting travel plans to Mexico. Inside the home, investigators noticed odd details. Summer's prescription sunglasses were left behind. Essential items like children's medication, clothing, and toiletry were untouched. It was as if the family had vanished in the middle of an ordinary evening. News of the disappearance spread quickly. A young family gone without a trace captured the attention of local media, and soon national outlets picked up the story. Theories began to swirl. Had the McStays been victims of foul play? Had they been targeted because of Joseph's business dealings? Or had they, for reasons unknown, fled to Mexico? The footage from the border crossing was played repeatedly on television. Some viewers swore it was the McStays. Others said the resemblance was weak at best. Meanwhile, the McStays' relatives pleaded for answers. Joseph's mother gave interviews, her voice breaking as she begged for her grandchildren to be found. Michael, Joseph's brother, remained convinced they would never have left voluntarily. But without solid leads, the case quickly began to stall. As weeks turned into months, investigators faced pressure to come up with answers. And so, the Mexico theory gained traction. It seemed the only logical explanation. The car was at the border. The footage showed a family of four. The FBI even became involved, searching for any sign of the McStays south of the border. But each lead came up empty. No confirmed sightings, no financial transactions, no evidence of new life in Mexico. At the same time, whispers began about Joseph's business partner, Chase Merritt. He had been the last known person to speak with Joseph. He had a criminal history involving theft and fraud, and he owed Joseph money. Could he have played a role? Or was this just another dead end in the case forward? For years, the McStay home in Fallbrook stood as an eerie reminder of that February night. Their belongings remained, their photos still on the walls. The McStay family's disappearance had become one of the most baffling mysteries in California. Four people, Joseph, Summer, and their two little boys, gone without a trace. The last known clue was a white Isuzu trooper parked near the Mexican border, and a grainy surveillance video showing a family of four walking into Tijuana. But beyond that, nothing. The FBI, the San Diego County Sheriff Department, and countless amateur sleuths tried to connect the dots. What they found would only deepen the mystery. From the very beginning, investigators leaned on one possibility, that the McStays had gone to Mexico voluntarily. After all, the evidence seemed to point that way. Their SUV was parked near the border, and surveillance footage from February 8 showed what appeared to be a family matching their description. But there were cracks in this theory. First, the family didn't have passports, and after 2009, passports were required to cross into Mexico. While it was possible to sneak across, would a mother like Summer, protective, even paranoid at times about her kids' safety, risk crossing illegally with two toddlers? Second, there were the dogs. The McStays adored their pets. Friends said Summer treated them like part of the family. Why would they leave them behind without food or care? Third, there were no financial signs of planned disappearance. The family's bank accounts were untouched. Credit cards said unused. Their mortgage and bills piled up unpaid. If they had planned to start a new life, where was the preparation? The Mexico theory was shaky. Yet for investigators desperate for answers, it seemed like the only explanation. Back at the McStay residence in Fallbrook, police combed through the house evidence. A carton of eggs had been left on the counter. 2 bowls of popcorn sat on the living room couch. The children's beloved toys were still inside. Summer's prescription sunglasses were left behind. To the outside world, it looked like the family had been interrupted in the middle of a normal evening. But interrupted by what? There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no fingerprints out of place. The house was clean, almost too clean. For many investigators, this raised the possibility that whatever happened to the McStays didn't happen inside their home. Instead, perhaps they were lured outside. One of the first major leads in the case came from Joseph's business dealings. Joseph owned and operated Earth-inspired products, a company that sold custom water fountains. His partner in the business was a man named Charles Chase Merritt. Chase was an outgoing, talkative, fast-moving kind of guy. But he also had a checkered past. He'd served prison time for burglary and theft, and he struggled with gambling debts. Joseph had trusted Chase, but to some, Chase seemed like the kind of man who could charm his way into opportunities, and then betray them. Phone records revealed that the very last call Joseph ever made was to Chase Merritt. The call lasted just over a minute on February 4th, the same night the family disappeared. When asked about it, Chase said Joseph had called him about a project they were working on. He claimed he had nothing to do with the disappearance, but suspicion lingered. Chase wasn't the only name investigators looked at. Some of McStay's past, friends and family said Summer was caring but also had a fiery temper. She had used several aliases over the years and had occasionally distanced herself from certain relatives. Was she hiding something? Could someone from her past have resurfaced? Joseph's finances, although his business was doing well, Joseph had occasional cash flow problems. Investigators wondered if he'd gotten involved with the wrong people. Could this have been a debt gone wrong? A random crime? The possibility also remained that the family had been victims of a random act of violence. A burglary gone wrong. A chance encounter. But again, nothing in the home suggested a struggle. As weeks turned into months, the McStays' relatives grew increasingly frustrated. Joseph's brother, Michael, was convinced they hadn't gone to Mexico. He pleaded with authorities to broaden the investigation. He conducted his own searches, passed out flyers, and gave emotional interviews to the press. Summer's sister echoed his feelings, insisting that Summer would never, under any circumstance, expose her boys to the dangers of living undocumented in Mexico. But with little to go on, the case grew cold. By 2011, the McStay case was a true crime obsession. Documentaries were produced. Talk shows invited experts and psychics to speculate. Online forums lit up with theories, some reasonable, some wild. Some suggested that the McStays had joined a cult. Others believed they had entered a witness protection program. More far-fetched theories even suggested abduction by a cartel, or that Joseph had staged a disappearance himself. The mystery was so compelling because of how ordinary the family seemed. They weren't wealthy socialites. They weren't celebrities. They were everyday people, living an everyday life, and that made their disappearance all the more chilling. Through it all, suspicion around Chase Merritt never went away. Chase was the last person Joseph had spoken to. He admitted he had a gambling problem, often losing thousands of dollars in a single night. He owed Joseph money, a debt that friends said had become a source of tension. And perhaps most suspiciously, after the McStays vanished, Chase began cashing checks from Joseph's business account. Investigators noted that his handwriting appeared forged on several of them. When questioned, Chase said Joseph had given him permission to write the checks, but police were unconvinced. Still, without bodies, without hard evidence, there was no way to prove what happened. From 2010 to 2013, the McStay case dragged on with no resolution. Their house sat empty, a ghostly reminder of a family frozen in time. Their bank accounts remained untouched. Their SUV sat in impound, no new clues discovered. Theories continued, but answers remained elusive. For the McStays' relatives, it was agony. Every day brought new speculation, but no truth. Were Joseph and Summer alive? Were Johnny and little Joseph Jr. safe somewhere? Or were they gone forever? The Mexico theory continued to dominate, but hope began to fade. November 2013. More than 3 years had passed since the McStay family vanished from their Fallbrook home. 4 years, their relatives had lived in agonizing uncertainty, trapped between hope and despair. But in the Mojave Desert, 100 miles north of their home, the mystery was about to unravel, and what it revealed was darker than anyone had imagined. On November 11, 2013, a motorcyclist exploring a remote stretch of desert near Victorville noticed something unusual. As he rode through the dusty, barren landscape, he spotted a skull protruding from the sand. Authorities were called, and soon investigators uncovered shallow graves. Inside them were the skeletal remains of 2 adults and 2 children. Scattered nearby were scraps of clothing, worn shoes, a child's blanket, silent echoes of families' final moments. But it was one object in particular that caught investigators' attention: a rusty sledgehammer lying near the graves. Dental record confirmed what many had long feared. The remains belonged to Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and little Joseph Jr. The McStay family had not crossed into Mexico to start a new life. They had been brutally murdered and dumped in the desert. The case had shifted. It was no longer a disappearance. It was now a quadruple homicide. Forensic investigators studied the remains and determined that blunt force trauma was a cause of death for both Joseph and Summer. The children, heartbreakingly, were also believed to have been struck and killed in the same manner. The presence of the sledgehammer told its own story, a crime of rage carried out up close and personal. It wasn't random. Whoever killed the McStays had taken the time to dig shallow graves, conceal their bodies, and leave them in the desert. This was someone who had known them, someone with a reason to want them gone. With the discovery, the Mexico theory crumbled instantly. Investigators now had proof that the family hadn't vanished voluntarily. They had been murdered. So who had the motive? Police turned once again to those closest to the family, and one name kept rising to the surface: Charles Chase Merritt. Chase Merritt wasn't just Joseph's business partner. He was also the last person known to have spoken with him. The final phone call from Joseph's cell phone on February 4, 2010, had been to Chase. Investigators now re-examined Merritt's behavior in the days following the family's disappearance. What they found was damning. Forged checks. Within days of the McStays vanishing, Chase had begun writing checks to himself on Joseph's business account, over $20,000 worth. Handwriting experts determined the signatures had been forged. Gambling debts. Merritt was deeply in debt, often gambling away large sums at local casinos. Records showed he had lost thousands in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. Inconsistent alibis. Chase told investigators he had last seen Joseph early in the day on February 4th, but his timeline shifted under questioning. To detectives, it was becoming clear Merritt had the motive, the opportunity, and the means. Around this time, Merritt sat down for an on-camera interview with a reporter. What he said only raised more suspicion. He described Joseph as my best friend, but also claimed he believed the family had been killed. This was before the bodies had even been discovered. Most people still clung to the hope that the McStays were alive somewhere, but Merritt seemed oddly certain they were dead. For investigators, it was a chilling red flag. By 2014, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to take action. They looked closely at cell phone records, financial documents, and Merritt's movements. Cell tower data. Merritt's phone had pinged near the McStay home on the night of the disappearance. Later, it pinged in the Victorville desert, the same area where the graves were eventually found. Financial motive. Investigators believed Merritt was embezzling money from Joseph's business, and that Joseph had discovered the theft. If true, this would have given Merritt a powerful motive to silence him. Murder weapon. Though not definitively proven, the sledgehammer found in the gravesite was linked circumstantially to Merritt. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. On November 5, 2014, nearly 4 years after the McStay family vanished, police arrested Charles Chase Merritt in connection with their murders. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. News of the arrest shocked those who had followed the case for years. For some, it brought relief. At last, someone would stand trial. For others, it raised new questions. Could Merritt, the chatty, fast-talking business partner, really be capable of such brutality? Prosecutors believed the answer was yes. According to prosecutors, the story unfolded like this. Joseph had discovered Merritt stealing money from their business. On February 4th, 2010, Joseph confronted him. Merritt, fearing exposure and financial ruin, snapped. He murdered Joseph, then turned on Summer, Johnny, and little Joseph Jr., eliminating all possible witnesses. He then drove their bodies into the desert, buried them in shallow graves, and attempted to cover his tracks by forging checks from Joseph's account. The motive was money, the method was rage, and the evidence, prosecutors argued, pointed squarely at Merritt. But Merritt did not go down quietly. At trial, his defense team painted him as a scapegoat. They claimed investigators had tunnel vision, zeroing in on him while ignoring other possibilities. They pointed fingers at Joseph's wife, Summer, suggesting she had enemies or a hidden past. They questioned the reliability of the cell phone data, and they argued that there was no direct forensic evidence linking Merritt to the gravesite. For years, the trial would drag on, delayed, debated, dissected, and the world watched, waiting to see if justice for the McStays would finally be served. For the McStays' relatives, the discovery of the bodies was both devastating and a grim form of closure. Joseph's brother Michael spoke often about the pain of losing not just his brother, but also his nephews, two boys whose lives had barely begun. Summer's family expressed outrage that anyone could harm a woman so devoted to the children. The arrest of Merritt gave them some hope, but as the trial loomed, the outcome was far from certain. The McStay case had always fascinated the public, but now, with the arrest of Merritt, it exploded into one of the most closely followed trials in recent memory. The idea that a family man could murder his closest friend and business partner shocked many, but others saw it as tragically believable. By 2014, the mystery of the McStay family had finally shifted to a murder case. The shallow graves in the Mojave Desert revealed the truth. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and little Joseph Jr. hadn't walked into Mexico. They hadn't started a new life. They had been brutally murdered, and prosecutors believed they knew who had done it. Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph's longtime business partner and friend. But proving his guilt would take years. After Merritt's arrest in November 2014, many expected a swift trial, but the case quickly bogged down in delays. Merritt changed attorneys multiple times, at one point even trying to represent himself. Pre-trial hearings stretched on as lawyers debated evidence, jury selection, and Merritt's right to a fair trial. Meanwhile, the McStay family's relatives sat through hearing after hearing, desperate for closure but forced to relive the nightmare over and over again. It would be 5 long years before the case finally reached the jury. In January 2019, the trial of Charles Chase Merritt began in San Bernardino County. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and true crime followers who had waited nearly a decade for answers. The prosecution laid out a chilling narrative. They argued that Merritt had been embezzling money from Joseph's business. Bank records showed that in the days leading up to the disappearance, Joseph had confronted him about thousands of dollars that had gone missing. On February 4th, 2010, the very night the McStays vanished, Joseph called Merritt. Prosecutors claimed this was a confrontation that triggered Merritt's rage. Fueled by desperation and fear of exposure, Merritt drove to the McStay home. Armed with a sledgehammer, he bludgeoned Joseph to death. Then, to eliminate witnesses, he turned on Summer and the boys. He loaded their bodies into the family's SUV, drove them to the desert, and buried them in shallow graves. The next day, Merritt began forging checks from Joseph's account, stealing thousands of dollars as if nothing had happened. The sledgehammer found with the bodies, the financial evidence, and Merritt's suspicious behavior all painted a damning picture. But Merritt's defense team pushed back hard. They argued that the case was circumstantial. There was no DNA linking Merritt to the gravesite, no fingerprints on the sledgehammer, no eyewitnesses to the murders. They suggested that Joseph's wife, Summer, had enemies or a hidden past that could have caught up with her. Others hinted at shadowy business dealings that might have led to the family's murder. Merritt himself sat in court, at times emotional, at times competent. He insisted he had nothing to do with the killings. But as the weeks went on, the mountain of circumstantial evidence grew harder to ignore. After months of testimony, the case went to the jury in June 2019. The deliberations lasted a week. Family members sat in the courtroom, hearts pounding, waiting for the verdict. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. Charles Chase Merritt was found guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. After nearly a decade of uncertainty, the McStay family finally had justice. But justice was not the end of the story. In January 2020, Merritt faced sentencing. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the murders were not only brutal but also calculated, the killing of 2 young children alongside their parents. The defense begged for mercy, claiming Merritt's life should be spared. When the judge read the sentence, it was final. Charles Chase Merritt was sentenced to death. The man once considered Joseph's trusted business partner, a regular at the McStay family dinner table, would now spend the rest of his life on death row. For the relatives of the McStays, the verdict brought a complicated mix of relief and heartbreak. Joseph's brother Michael said he was grateful for the conviction, but no sentence had erased the pain of losing not only his brother but also his nephews and sister-in-law. Summer's family spoke of her fierce love for her children, remembering her as a devoted mother who would never have let harm come to them. The families described the trial as both a blessing and torment. Closure, yes, but also the reopening of wounds every time the details were recounted in court. Even with a conviction, some questions remain. Why did Merritt go so far as to kill not just Joseph, but Summer and the boys as well? Was it truly about money, or something deeper, something more personal? Why did it take so long for investigators to look past the Mexico theory, even as the McStay's relatives insisted it didn't make sense? And most haunting of all, what exactly happened inside the McStay home that February night? The graves tell us the ending, but the details of the family's final hours may never be known. The McStay case became one of the most infamous true crime stories of the 21st century. It reminded the world how quickly an ordinary family could vanish, and how difficult it can be to separate fact from speculation. It also highlighted the flaws of early investigations, the dangers of tunnel vision, and the resilience of families determined to uncover the truth. Today, the Fallbrook home where the McStays once lived belongs to new owners. But for those who followed the case, it remains a symbol of the mystery that gripped the world. The Mojave Desert, too, holds its scars, the place where 4 lives were stolen, and where their story was finally uncovered. And in San Quentin State Prison, Charles Chase Merritt sits on death row, awaiting an execution that may never come. His fate sealed not just by evidence, but by the enduring memory of a family that vanished overnight. The McStay disappearance is no longer an unsolved mystery, but it remains, to this day, a tragedy that haunts those who knew them, and a story that reminds us how fragile life can be. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. should have had decades of life ahead of them. Instead, their story became a cautionary tale of trust, betrayal, and the darkness that can hide in plain sight. As the years pass, the McStay family is remembered not for the way they died, but for the love they shared, a family torn away too soon, but never forgotten.